Tonight. Don't tell anyone you're my wife. Those 7 words came from the man who had promised 6 years earlier to stand beside me no matter what. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and until that moment, I believed I knew exactly who my husband was. We were standing beneath the glowing entrance of the Grand Crescent Hotel, where Daniel's company was hosting its annual charity gala. Luxury cars pulled up one after another. Camera flashes lit the entrance every few seconds as executives and their spouses stepped onto the red carpet. I should have been excited. Daniel had talked about this event for nearly a month. Every evening he'd come home discussing the guest list, the board members, the investors, and especially the company's CEO, Victoria Hayes. He kept saying how important this night was for his career and how much he wanted me by his side. So I believed him. I bought a simple emerald green dress after saving for weeks. Nothing extravagant, just something elegant enough to make Daniel proud when he introduced me to the people he'd worked so hard to impress. Instead, he looked at me with nervous eyes and quietly said, "If anyone asks, tell them you're helping the catering staff." For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking. I even smiled. He didn't. The silence between us became heavier than the evening air. Finally, I asked softly, "Why would I say that?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, something he always did when he was uncomfortable. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." He hesitated before answering. "A few people at work found out you used to work at the Hawthorne Hotel." I nodded. I did. That job had paid my tuition. It had paid my rent. Some nights I cleaned rooms. Other nights I helped prepare banquet halls for weddings and conferences. There was nothing glamorous about it, but there was nothing shameful about it either. Daniel knew that. In fact, when we first started dating, he used to brag about my determination. He'd tell his friends, "Natalie built her life from nothing." Back then, he admired my hard work. Somewhere along the way, that admiration quietly turned into embarrassment. "Melissa keeps making jokes," he admitted. "What kind of jokes?" He looked away. "She calls you the maid." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were true, because Daniel cared enough about those jokes to ask me to hide who I was. I looked into his eyes, searching for the man I married. The man who used to bring me coffee during my late-night design projects. The man who cried when I surprised him with a down payment for our first apartment after taking on extra freelance work. The man who once held my hands and said, "I'll spend my whole life making sure you're never ashamed of where you came from." I wondered where that man had gone. Daniel stepped closer. "Natalie, please, it's just one night. I've worked so hard to earn their respect." I wanted to ask him a simple question. "What about mine?" But the words never left my mouth. Instead, I smiled. A small, tired smile. "If pretending I'm someone else helps you tonight, I'll do it." Relief washed over his face so quickly that it almost hurt to watch. He kissed my forehead. "Thank you." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "You deserve better." Just, "Thank you." As if I had agreed to pick up groceries instead of pretending my marriage didn't exist. Together, we walked toward the hotel's entrance. Halfway there, Daniel slowed down. "I think it's better if we go in separately." That sentence hurt even more than the first one. I simply nodded. "Okay." He disappeared through the grand front doors, where guests were being welcomed with champagne and photographers called out names. I stood outside alone for another few seconds. Then I quietly walked toward the side entrance marked catering and event staff. A young employee holding a clipboard smiled politely. "Good evening. Are you with the catering company?" I looked back toward the ballroom doors where my husband had just disappeared without me. Then I answered the only way I could. "Tonight, I guess I am. As I stepped inside, I had no idea that before the night was over, every executive in that ballroom, including Daniel, would witness a moment none of them could have imagined. Less than 20 minutes later, the CEO entered the ballroom, glanced across hundreds of guests, and the moment her eyes landed on me, she stopped walking. The side entrance closed quietly behind me. Unlike the grand lobby, there were no crystal chandeliers or photographers here. Only stainless steel counters, rolling carts, and servers rushing from one room to another. Someone handed me a glass of sparkling water. "Can you take this into ballroom A?" A young waitress asked without even looking up. I smiled politely and accepted it. For the first time that evening, nobody cared about expensive dresses or job titles. Everyone was simply trying to do their work. Ironically, it felt more genuine than the ballroom Daniel was so desperate to impress. I walked through a service corridor until I reached a pair of tall doors leading into the gala. The room beyond looked breathtaking. Golden lights reflected off enormous crystal chandeliers. Round tables covered in white linen stretched across the ballroom. A string quartet played softly near the stage while waiters moved gracefully between guests. Nearly every person in the room wore a designer suit or an evening gown. Conversations filled the air. Laughter, business deals, polite smiles. Everyone seemed determined to appear successful. I quietly stepped inside and stayed close to the catering staff, exactly as Daniel had asked. No one noticed me. At least, not at first. Daniel stood near the center of the ballroom with 3 co-workers. His confident smile looked different tonight. Practiced, carefully controlled. I watched him laugh at something one of the executives said. A moment later, a blonde woman in a silver dress joined the group. Melissa, even from across the room. I recognized the smug smile Daniel had mentioned earlier. She glanced around the ballroom until her eyes landed on me. Then she smiled, not kindly, knowingly. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered something. The 2 executives beside them laughed. Daniel looked in my direction. For just a second, our eyes met. I expected him to wave, to smile, anything. Instead, he looked away. My chest tightened, not because strangers were laughing, because my own husband pretended he didn't know me. "Natalie?" The voice startled me. I turned around to see an elderly waiter balancing a tray of champagne glasses. "I've seen you before, haven't I?" I smiled. "I don't think so." He studied my face for a moment. "You remind me of someone who worked here years ago." I did. His face brightened. "I knew it. You always stayed late after the charity banquets. You even helped us when the kitchen flooded one winter." I laughed softly. "I remember that. You never complained," he said. "We all thought you'd go far." His words warmed my heart far more than he probably realized. Sometimes, respect comes from the people who remember your character, not your resume. Before I could reply, the ballroom lights dimmed. A voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Chief Executive Officer of Hawthorne Global, Miss Victoria Hayes." The entire room rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Daniel straightened his jacket immediately. Melissa fixed her smile. Every executive suddenly stood a little taller. Victoria Hayes entered with quiet confidence. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need to be. She greeted board members with warm handshakes, thanked several employees by name, and even stopped to compliment one of the musicians before making her way toward the stage. Then, something unexpected happened. She stopped walking. Her smile slowly disappeared. Her eyes focused on someone across the ballroom. Me. For several long seconds, she didn't move. Neither did I. The conversations around us faded. She looked as though she had just seen someone she hadn't expected to find. Without saying a word, She changed direction. Instead of walking toward the stage, she walked directly toward me. The closer she came, the quieter the ballroom became. Guests turned to watch. Melissa frowned. Daniel noticed the change and followed Victoria with his eyes. The color drained from his face. He looked from the CEO to me, then back again. I had never seen him look so confused. Victoria finally stopped only a few feet away. Her eyes filled with emotion. She searched my face as if trying to confirm something she'd been hoping was true. Then, in front of every executive, every board member, and my horrified husband, she smiled, opened her arms, and wrapped me in a warm embrace. The ballroom fell completely silent. As she pulled back, tears shimmered in her eyes. Then she spoke words that made every person in the room stare at me in disbelief. Natalie, after all these years, I finally found you. The ballroom was so quiet that I could hear the soft clink of a champagne glass somewhere behind me. No one spoke. No one moved. Victoria Hayes, the woman every executive in the room admired, had just hugged the woman my husband had asked to pretend she was part of the catering staff. She stepped back, still holding both of my hands. Her eyes scanned my face as though she couldn't believe. I was standing in front of her. "I've been trying to find you for years," she whispered. My heart pounded. "I'm sorry." She smiled through watery eyes. "You probably don't remember me." I searched her face carefully. Elegant, confident, familiar, but I couldn't place her. "I'm afraid I don't." Victoria nodded. "I didn't think you would." Around us, every conversation had stopped. The board members looked confused. Melissa's confident smile had completely disappeared. Daniel stood frozen several feet away, unable to take his eyes off us. Victoria finally turned toward the audience. "I think dinner can wait a few minutes." A few guests laughed nervously. She looked back at me. "Would you mind walking with me?" I hesitated for only a second before nodding. Of course. As we walked toward the front of the ballroom, I could actually feel hundreds of eyes following us. Daniel instinctively took a step forward. "Victoria," she politely raised one finger without even looking at him. "I'll speak with you later, Daniel." "Not now." "Later." His face lost what little color it still had. Victoria guided me into a smaller reception lounge beside the ballroom. The room was quiet, decorated with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. She closed the door behind us. For the first time since entering the gala, I could finally breathe. She looked at me with the same warm smile. "I owe you an apology." I blinked. "For what?" "For never finding you." Now I was even more confused. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." She shook her head immediately. "No, I've never forgotten your face." She took a slow breath. 14 years ago, there was a fire at the Hawthorne Hotel. The words hit me instantly. The memory returned so vividly that I could almost smell the smoke. It had happened during my second year working there. One of the upper floor suites had caught fire after an electrical fault. Guests had been evacuated. Everyone except a little girl. I closed my eyes for a second. "Emily." Victoria smiled. "You remember. She was your daughter." Victoria nodded. "She was only 8. The firefighters couldn't reach her immediately. You went upstairs before anyone stopped you." I looked down at my hands. "I wasn't thinking." "You were. You were thinking about a frightened little girl." Victoria's voice cracked. "You carried my daughter down those stairs while smoke filled the hallway. I tried to thank you afterward, but you disappeared." I smiled awkwardly. "I changed jobs a few weeks later. You saved my daughter's life. I've spent 14 years hoping I'd have the chance to thank you properly." I felt my cheeks grow warm. "I don't think anyone deserves thanks for doing what was right." Victoria laughed softly. "That's exactly why I wanted to find you. A knock interrupted us. One of the event coordinators opened the door carefully. "Miss Hayes, the board is waiting." Victoria nodded. "They can wait another minute." The coordinator quietly disappeared again. Victoria turned back toward me. "So, what are you doing these days?" "I'm a freelance interior designer." Her eyes widened. "Really?" I nodded. "I left hospitality years ago." She smiled proudly. "I knew you wouldn't stay in one place forever." Back inside the ballroom, people had started whispering. Melissa folded her arms. "This doesn't make any sense." One executive quietly replied. "Apparently she knows the CEO." Daniel heard every word. His jaw tightened. For the first time that evening, he looked nervous. Not because of his presentation, not because of the investors, because he had absolutely no idea what Victoria Hayes was about to say next. Victoria walked back into the ballroom beside me, instead of several steps ahead. That single gesture changed the atmosphere immediately. Executives who had ignored me only minutes earlier suddenly smiled. Board members nodded politely. People who hadn't even noticed I existed were now trying to introduce themselves. I noticed Daniel watching every second of it. His expression wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was panic. The kind of panic that comes from realizing one terrible decision has already become impossible to undo. Victoria stepped onto the stage. She adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent again. Then she looked directly at me before facing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue tonight's program, I'd like to tell you a story about courage." Daniel slowly lowered his head, because for the first time all evening, he understood exactly who that story was about. Victoria smiled warmly at the audience. Then she said the one sentence Daniel had prayed she never would. "The woman who saved my daughter's life is standing in this room tonight." The woman who saved my daughter's life is standing in this room tonight. For a heartbeat, nobody reacted. Then the ballroom erupted into applause. It wasn't polite applause. It was the kind that comes from genuine admiration. People rose from there, chairs one after another, until almost the entire ballroom was standing. I froze. I had never liked being the center of attention. I glanced toward Daniel. Only 30 minutes earlier, he'd asked me to pretend I was part of the catering staff. Now, the very people he wanted to impress were applauding me. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Victoria smiled and motioned for the applause to settle. "I know tonight is supposed to be about celebrating another successful year for our company," she began. "But before we celebrate business, I want to celebrate character." The room became silent again. 14 years ago, my daughter Emily almost died in a hotel fire. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. I remember arriving outside the building just as firefighters were trying to reach her. Victoria paused, taking a slow breath. I remember feeling completely helpless. Then a young hotel employee disappeared into the smoke. She looked directly at me. Everyone shouted for her to stop. She ignored them. Minutes later, she walked back out carrying my daughter. I lowered my eyes. Even after all these years, remembering that night still made my hands shake. Victoria continued. "I offered her a reward. She refused. I offered to pay for her education. She refused. I asked for her address so I could thank her properly. She smiled and simply said, 'Just make sure your daughter has a beautiful life.'" The ballroom became completely still. I could hear people quietly sniffing around me. Victoria smiled. "My daughter is graduating from medical school next month." A wave of applause filled the room again, and none of that would have been possible without Natalie Brooks. This time, the applause felt even louder. When the room finally settled, Victoria stepped down from the stage and walked back toward me. She gently squeezed my shoulder. I spent 14 years wishing I could repay you. I smiled softly. You don't owe me anything. I never wanted anything. I know, she replied. That's exactly why people like you deserve everything. She turned toward the audience. I think everyone here deserves to meet Natalie. Within seconds, executives, department directors, investors, even board members began walking toward me. One after another, they introduced themselves. It's an honor to meet you. I've heard incredible things. Thank you for what you did. The same people who hadn't looked at me 20 minutes earlier were now waiting in line, just to shake my hand. Across the room, Daniel stood completely alone. Melissa tried to laugh. This is getting a little dramatic. No one answered her. She looked around awkwardly. For the first time all evening, nobody cared what she had to say. Daniel slowly approached us. Natalie. His voice was barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, Victoria turned toward him. You must be Daniel. Yes, I'm Natalie's husband. There was an uncomfortable pause. Victoria smiled politely. You have an extraordinary wife. I hope you tell her that often. Daniel swallowed hard. He couldn't finish the sentence because he knew the truth. He hadn't told me that in a very long time. Dinner was finally served, but something had changed. Instead of sitting with the catering staff, Victoria insisted I sit at her table. Right beside her, the seat had originally been reserved for one of the company's vice presidents. Without hesitation, she asked the event coordinator to move him elsewhere. The vice president smiled and said, I'd be honored. Daniel watched the entire exchange. He had spent weeks hoping to sit close to the CEO. Instead, his wife was seated there, not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of kindness shown 14 years earlier. Throughout dinner, Victoria asked about my work. So tell me about your design business. I laughed. It's still small. I mostly renovate family homes and cafes. Do you enjoy it? I love it. Then you're already successful. Daniel quietly listened from another table. Every word seemed to weigh heavier on him. As dessert was being served, Victoria suddenly smiled. Natalie, I'd like to ask you something. Of course. Our company recently purchased an old historic building downtown. We're turning it into our new headquarters. She paused. I've been searching for the right interior designer. The entire table looked at me. Victoria smiled warmly. I'd like you to lead the project. My fork slipped from my hand. The room fell silent once again. This wasn't a small renovation. Everyone in the city knew about that building. It was the largest project Hawthorne Global had ever announced. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. Even Melissa's mouth fell open. Victoria wasn't offering me charity. She was offering me an opportunity, one I had spent years dreaming about. I hadn't even found the words to answer when someone stood up from the back of the ballroom and interrupted us. Victoria, I'm afraid that's not possible. Every head turned toward the unfamiliar voice, and Daniel's expression changed from shock to absolute fear. I'm afraid that's not possible. The unfamiliar voice echoed across the ballroom, cutting through the silence like a knife. Every head turned toward the entrance. A tall man in his early 60s walked confidently into the room, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He wasn't wearing an employee badge, yet several members of the board immediately recognized him. Mr. Whitmore, one of the directors, stood up. I didn't know you were coming. Daniel's face tightened. He clearly knew exactly who the man was. Victoria remained calm. Richard, she said with a polite smile. I wasn't expecting you tonight. I know, he replied. But this couldn't wait. He stopped beside the stage and looked directly at Victoria. I heard you offering someone the headquarters renovation. That's right, and I'd like to make sure the board hears something before any contracts are signed. The ballroom fell silent once again. I glanced at Daniel. He wasn't simply nervous anymore. He looked terrified. Richard slowly opened his portfolio. I've worked with Hawthorne Global for nearly 20 years as an independent construction consultant. He looked toward me. Miss Brooks, I've actually seen your work. My eyebrows lifted in surprise. You have? He smiled. 3 years ago, you redesigned the Maple Street Community Center. I nodded. It was one of my favorite projects. So it was mine. He reached into his folder and placed several photographs on the nearest table. They're exceptional. People leaned closer. Even from where I stood, I recognized the pictures. The children's reading room, the open cafe, the restored brick walls. The entire project had been completed on a very small budget. Richard looked around the room. I've reviewed projects from dozens of firms. Some charge millions. Very few understand how people actually use the space. He picked up another photograph. Miss Brooks does. Victoria smiled proudly. I had a feeling. Richard nodded. So did I. Daniel suddenly stepped forward. Richard, I don't think tonight is the right time for this. Richard turned slowly toward him. No. Daniel forced a smile. This project should go through the normal selection process. Several executives exchanged curious looks. Victoria folded her arms. It usually does. Richard looked at Daniel for a long moment. That's interesting, because last month, you recommended Melissa Grant. The room became noticeably quieter. Melissa's confident expression disappeared. Victoria looked between them. Daniel? He cleared his throat. Melissa has experience. Richard raised an eyebrow. Does she? He pulled another document from his folder. The portfolio submitted under Melissa Grant's name contains photographs from Natalie Brooks' Maple Street project. The room froze. I felt my stomach drop. What? Richard laid both portfolios side by side. One carried my business logo. The other carried Melissa's. The photographs were identical. Even the lighting, even the angles. Someone at the table whispered, "They're the same." Another executive leaned forward. Oh my God. Daniel's breathing became uneven. Melissa stood so quickly that her chair nearly tipped over. That's ridiculous. Richard calmly slid another page across the table. I checked the original image files. The metadata confirms they belong to Natalie Brooks. Melissa shook her head violently. I didn't know. Richard interrupted. The submission was emailed from your company account. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward her. She looked helplessly toward Daniel. For just a split second, it was enough. Victoria noticed. So did the board. So did I. Melissa wasn't looking for help. She was looking for Daniel. Victoria slowly turned toward my husband. Daniel, is there something you'd like to explain? No. His answer came far too quickly. I had nothing to do with that. Richard remained perfectly calm. I wasn't finished. He reached into the portfolio one last time. I also brought the internal email chain. Daniel's face lost every trace of color. Richard looked directly at him. The email recommending Melissa's portfolio was written by you. Silence. No excuses. No whispers. Just silence. Victoria took the printed emails and quietly read them. The longer she read, the colder her expression became. Finally, she lowered the papers. You knew this wasn't Melissa's work. Daniel couldn't speak. You knew the designs belonged to your wife. Still nothing. Victoria asked one final question. Did you try to help someone else steal your wife's career? Because you were ashamed of admitting how talented she really is? The question hung in the air. Daniel slowly closed his eyes. For the first time all evening, he had no answer. I looked at him, searching for the man I'd married. Instead, I saw someone so desperate for acceptance. that he'd been willing to sacrifice, the one person who had always believed in him. That realization hurt far more than the lie itself. Victoria carefully closed the folder. Then she looked at me. "Natalie, I owe you another apology. You should have been sitting across from us as the designer of our new headquarters months ago." She turned toward the board. "I believe we've delayed this long enough." One board member nodded immediately. "So do I." Another followed. "I second that." Then another. Within seconds, the decision was unanimous. The project would belong to me. Not because Victoria was grateful, because the evidence proved I had earned it. Daniel watched everything collapse around him. His reputation, his credibility, his carefully constructed image. It was all slipping away. Just when I thought the night couldn't become any more painful, Daniel quietly whispered 6 words that changed everything. "Natalie, I need to tell you something." And the look in his eyes told me this wasn't about the stolen designs. It was something much bigger. "Natalie, I need to tell you something." Daniel's voice was barely audible. The confident marketing manager who had spent weeks preparing for this gala was gone. Standing in front of me was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. I stared at him without saying a word. For 6 years, I'd learned that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. Victoria glanced between us. "If this is a private conversation, we can step away." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No." He swallowed hard. "I think everyone deserves to hear it." A murmur spread across the ballroom. The board members exchanged curious looks. Melissa stood perfectly still, avoiding everyone's eyes. Daniel rubbed his trembling hands together before speaking again. "When Melissa first joined the company," he began, "she wasn't just another co-worker." My stomach tightened. She became friends with several board members very quickly. I wanted the same opportunities. So, I started spending more time with her. His words sounded rehearsed, as if he'd repeated them to himself hundreds of times. She kept telling me that appearances mattered more than talent. He gave a bitter laugh. At first I thought she was wrong, but after every promotion, I started believing her. I didn't interrupt. Neither did anyone else. Daniel looked directly at me. "One afternoon, Melissa saw the photos of your renovation projects on my laptop. I immediately remembered that day. I'd asked Daniel to proofread a proposal before sending it to a client. He'd promised he would. Instead, he'd left the laptop open in his office. She asked who designed them. I told her you did." Daniel lowered his head. She laughed. "Your wife? The hotel maid?" His voice cracked. "She said no executive would ever hire someone with that background." Several people in the ballroom shifted uncomfortably. Daniel continued. "She convinced me that if I wanted to move up in the company, I needed to stop talking about where we came from." He paused, "And eventually, I stopped talking about you." The words hurt, but somehow, I already knew they were true. Victoria folded her arms. "So your solution was to pretend your wife didn't exist?" Daniel closed his eyes. "I know how awful that sounds." "No," Victoria replied quietly. "You don't." Silence filled the room again. Daniel turned back toward me. "When Hawthorne announced the headquarters renovation, I remembered your portfolio. I knew you could win it." His next sentence made my heart sink. "I also knew Melissa wanted it." Richard Whitmore looked at him carefully. "So you gave her Natalie's work?" Daniel nodded. "I told myself it was temporary. I thought if Melissa got the contract, she'd owe me. And maybe I'd finally get the promotion I'd been chasing." He looked at me with tears forming in his eyes. "I kept telling myself I'd make it up to you later. I never imagined tonight would happen." I stared at him, trying to understand how the man who once celebrated every one of my achievements had slowly become someone willing to erase them. It hadn't happened overnight. It had happened one compromise at a time, one excuse at a time, one lie at a time. Melissa finally stepped forward. "This isn't fair." Everyone looked at her. She pointed toward Daniel. "He's making it sound like I forced him." "No one forced him." Her voice grew sharper. "He's the one who offered me the portfolio. He said Natalie would never know." Daniel didn't deny it. Melissa laughed bitterly. "So don't act like I'm the only villain here." She looked directly at me. "I didn't steal your husband. I stole his ambition. He gave me everything else willingly." Those words hit Daniel harder than anyone else because they were true. Victoria let out a slow breath. "I've led this company for 23 years. I've fired people for poor performance. I've fired people for dishonesty. But I've never seen someone betray the person who believed in them the most." She turned to the board. "I don't think this is simply a personal matter anymore." One board member nodded. "It isn't." Another added, "This directly involves company ethics." Richard quietly closed his portfolio. "I believe my work here is finished." Daniel took one hesitant step toward me. "Natalie, I'm sorry. I know those words aren't enough. They never will be." He reached for my hand. For the first time in 6 years, I stepped back. Not because I hated him, because I no longer recognized him. The room watched in complete silence. Sometimes, the smallest movement says everything. Victoria gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to decide anything tonight." I nodded. She was right. Some decisions deserved a clear mind, not a broken heart. I picked up my purse, looked at Daniel one last time, then quietly walked toward the ballroom doors. No dramatic speech, no shouting, no revenge, just peace. Because I'd finally realized something. A person who hides your light doesn't deserve to stand in it with you. As I reached the hotel entrance, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Victoria Hayes. I answered. Her next sentence would change not only my career, but the rest of my life forever. The hotel doors had barely closed behind me when my phone rang. Victoria Hayes. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Tonight had already exhausted me emotionally, but something told me to answer. "Hello, Natalie," Victoria said gently. "Are you still outside? I just reached the parking lot. Would you mind coming back upstairs? There's something I'd like to discuss." I looked back at the hotel. Part of me wanted to drive home, lock the front door, and pretend this night had never happened. Instead, I took a deep breath. "I'll be there in a minute." Victoria was waiting in a private conference room with Richard, Whitmore, and 3 members of the board. The atmosphere was completely different from the ballroom. No cameras, no applause, just honest conversation. Victoria smiled as I entered. "Please have a seat." I did. Richard slid a folder across the table. "I think this belongs to you." I opened it carefully. Inside was a formal contract. *** lead interior designer. Hawthorne Global Headquarters renovation. ***. I stared at the first page. This can't be real." Victoria smiled. "It is." The board voted unanimously. No special treatment. No favors. Your work earned this. I looked around the room. I don't know what to say. Richard chuckled. "Then don't. Just do what you've always done. Create something extraordinary." Before I could respond, another board member leaned forward. "Natalie, Victoria has told us a lot about the kind of person you are. But tonight wasn't only about 14 years ago." I looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "When Richard brought your portfolio this afternoon, we quietly contacted every previous client." My eyes widened. "You did?" "We expected professional references." He laughed softly. "What we received was something much better." He picked up a sheet of paper. "She finished our community, sent her under budget, and donated her own weekends to help paint the children's library." Another page. "When my husband became sick halfway through our renovation, Natalie refused to charge us for the remaining design revisions." Another. "She treats every client like family." By the time he finished reading, My eyes were filled with tears. I had spent years believing no one noticed the small things. Apparently, they had. Victoria reached across the table. Companies can teach technical skills. They can't teach integrity. That's why you're here, for the first time all evening. I smiled without forcing it. 3 weeks later, construction officially began on Hawthorne Global's new headquarters. Walking through that century-old building for the first time felt surreal. Every empty room represented possibility. Every blueprint represented trust. I threw myself into the project. Long mornings, late evenings, coffee-fueled brainstorming sessions. I loved every second of it. Not because it was the biggest project of my career, because someone had believed in my ability before I believed in myself again. As for Daniel, the company completed its internal investigation. Melissa was dismissed immediately after the evidence of plagiarism was confirmed. Daniel wasn't fired. Instead, he resigned before the disciplinary hearing concluded. I later heard he'd accepted a much smaller position at another company in a different city. We didn't speak for nearly 2 months. Then one afternoon, he called. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know. I've started therapy." I finally realized I spent years chasing the approval of strangers, while taking for granted the only person who truly believed in me. There was no anger left in his voice, only regret. I wished him well, and then I wished him goodbye. Some relationships end with shouting. Ours ended with acceptance. 6 months later, the new headquarters opened. The building looked nothing like the abandoned structure I'd first walked into. Warm lighting, open collaboration spaces, local artwork, a community cafe supporting small businesses. It wasn't just an office.com. It was a place people wanted to be. During the opening ceremony, Victoria invited me onto the stage. I'd like everyone to meet the woman responsible for bringing this building back to life. The applause felt different this time, not because people finally knew my name, but because I finally knew my own worth. As the event ended, I walked through the lobby one last time. I caught my reflection in the glass entrance doors. Months earlier, I'd entered another hotel believing I needed someone else's approval to belong. Now, I understood something much more important. Your value is never determined by the people who are embarrassed by your past. It's determined by the character you carry into your future. Daniel once asked me to pretend I was invisible. Ironically, that was the night the world finally saw me.